Serious employers, what is the weirdest or creepiest thing you found during a background check on a potential employee? Story 1. One just came up, but it was not an employee, but someone who's threatening a friend of mine. I have to keep a lot of details vague, but I think the gist will come across. In my industry, we have guests for our events. Some of them are well-known actors and writers, some are famous industry folks, and then there's a lot of people who are on the tail edge of fame who are known for one thing, like a YouTube channel or something. Someone applied to be a guest at her event, let's call him Dave, who has a list of credits that seem dubious. Dave claims to have been a game designer, listing several popular legacy cult games along the lines of Duke Nukem, Quake, N64 James Bond, Pokemon Stadium, that sort of thing. All of them belong to the same big league company, let's call it Panasonic. Dave also claims to have been in a few Panasonic productions as a voice actor, script editor, and so on. Dave has several awards under his belt from Panasonic. Dave has been a guest at several conventions. Dave has created several conventions in the span of his career, so she looked them up. None of the games have him listed in the credits. The span of what he's claimed to work on, when subtracted from his age, would mean he started working for Panasonic when he was just 9 years old. His link to his IMDb page does not exist. When you cross-reference him to his acting and writing, only his name comes up in his own credits, like his Facebook page, listings under guest details at a few small conventions, his own website. Same with these Panasonic Excellence Awards, which do not exist at Panasonic, and we have industry contacts who can verify such things in a single phone call. The only reference to them is the same as the self-posted credit above. Dave's convention's guest listings can only be 50% verified. Big, well-known conventions don't have him listed at all. Small conventions have him listed, but we're talking 100 to 200 people one-day events at a local college, which is small. The rest are his own conventions. His own conventions have locations and addresses that are either hard to verify, veteran halls, elk lodges, hotel function rooms, or downright don't exist as function spaces one can have an event at, restaurants, storage facilities, vacant lots, or non-existent. There are a few people like this in our industry. The sad thing is that he's one of the few who have convinced a fan base to promote him, and if you turn him down, he'll demand to know why. If you tell him nothing you claim seems verifiable, he'll lose his crap. He'll threaten you, he'll claim libel, and he'll sue you. Dave has issues. Story 2. This happened to me in February 2016. This woman interviewed me, and I made her an offer contingent on her passing a state background check. She suddenly tries telling me I don't need to run one on her, in which I reply I absolutely need to, and it was state regulation. She let it go. I run the background, which takes about 2 full business days, before I can get the results and leave my office for the weekend. Come back on the Wednesday afterwards, and the background is waiting. There were more red flags than I've ever seen. These were a few of the things that came back. Number 1, criminal harassment. Number 2, a pending felony DUI with leaving the scene of an accident. Number 3, endangering the welfare of a child. I obviously call the woman and tell her we would not be able to hire her, and she wigs out on the phone, calling me a liar and other nonsense. So I calmly read all of her information she gave me back to her, and she confirmed it all, but couldn't explain the results. I stand by my decision and tell her good luck. Wasn't done though, unfortunately. I leave for lunch and come back to my secretary telling me that I had a couple there to see me. Lady shows up with her boyfriend and tries to guilt/intimidate me into changing my mind. I read her the state regulations verbatim and told her it could cost us our provider number. I wish I was making this next part up. With this guy present, she offers me a bejesus to overlook all of this and hire her. At this point, I tell her to leave my office and tell her not to come back. I tell my secretary under no circumstances to let them back into the building, and call the executive director and owner to tell them about what happened. During the call, I get a post note from my secretary who tells me that the couple are out in the parking lot looking around at cars, and she called the police. Cops show up and they think of some BS excuse like lost their keys in the lot. I immediately told the police what happened, and they escorted them off the property. Story 3. My story doesn't exactly fit the question because I was not the employer in the case, but it's along the same lines. I used to work in a place that also provided volunteer employment for men getting out of prison, to give them retail experience and something to put on their resume. We were not generally told what sort of offenses the men were incarcerated for. Our supervisor knew, but the employees were not given that information. However, a lot of the time they would tell us themselves. Usually it was things like drug charges or frauds. There was one man, however, that always stood out. He seemed very well-educated, well-spoken, very organized. I'm not saying that well-educated people never go to prison. Of course they do. However, the men we usually dealt with generally didn't fit that description. My coworkers and I were all curious what kind of crime he might have committed. One day, one of my coworkers happened to see a piece of paper or something with his name on it. We usually only knew them by their first names. He decided to Google it. Obviously, we are not supposed to do that, hence the no last names policy. But he did anyway and discovered that this guy had ended the life of one of his foster children. We were all a little shocked. We'd had red rummers before, but they had been drug beef and crap like that. Not child life enders. I had a hard time working with him after that, but luckily he was only with us for a few months. He never did tell us himself what he had done, and of course we couldn't say anything. It was awkward, though. Story 4. Interviewed a woman once, and it went pretty well. I had a cubicle, so we used my boss's office, since my boss was out of town. She gives the right answers and has related experience in a somewhat specialized field. Calm, composed, generally on point. Mentally, I had placed her in the top 2 contenders. When I got back to my desk from dropping her off at the elevator bank, there was an email from HR with the subject line, "Please call us immediately." The voicemail light is also flashing. What follows are a series of gradually more panicked messages from the HR rep, starting with, "Hello, Alan, this is your HR rep, hoping to catch you before your interview. Call me." Ending with, "Alan, call me right now." Apparently, when the candidate came in, HR made a mistake and sent her on the wrong interview with another manager offering a similar position, but not the one she was looking for. She figured this out, abruptly and somewhat rudely ended the interview, then went back to HR. This manager called up HR and said, "Hey, there's been a mistake, but you should know this person went kind of bonkers." In HR, the candidate screamed at the assistant, called her names like stupid and retarded, then insisted on going on the interview with me. The assistant was a newbie and sent her on the correct interview, then went into her boss's office and broke down in tears. The calls were various HR people trying to locate this person and have her escorted from the building. Story 5. I was a hiring manager for a while at my place of employment, had a decent candidate. He was applying for an overnight position, so his slight lack of social skills wasn't too bad. He had a decent work history and told us he'd been through a recent divorce and had been down on his luck for a while, which explained an 18-month gap in employment. He answered no to the conviction question. His drug test was fine, so I started his background check and told him we'd bring him back in to finish up paperwork once it was returned. 4 days later, the check was still pending, which usually suggests that the candidate has some sort of record and our HR department is investigating. A week and a half pass, and the candidate has called a few times asking what's up. I have no answer. Finally, I get the big "do not hire" on his status, as well as an email from HR. The email was basically along the lines of, "Do not hire candidate. Do not contact candidate. If a candidate comes into your location, insist he leaves immediately." I never saw the guy after that, and I don't know what they found. I misread the "do not contact" line as a repeated "do not hire" line, and it read like something out of a horror movie. Story 6. I've got some weird employment stories, but here's one of the more unusual. I had recently been hired via a contracted group for an IT-related job. Long story short, I was sitting in orientation the first day, getting assigned a user ID and such, the very basics. They did the drug tests already, so everyone had been cleared, but because they were rushing to get a group in, background checks had not all been cleared. There's a knock at the door of the training room. Local sheriffs step in and ask for the guy who happens to be sitting right next to me. He was a young kid, maybe 20 or 21 if I had to guess. He stands up and leaves. The rest of the day, we made a few jokes about whether we should box up his things. The trainer tells us he won't be returning and doesn't comment further. A few days later, there's an article in the paper. The kid had a warrant for his arrest for a red rum charge. As if things weren't already a little crazy, about a week later, a surveillance tape is released on the news that this kid shot someone in broad daylight in what seemed like a small robbery. Was pretty crazy piecing everything together once I realized it all. Story 7. I was a hiring manager for a seasonal store. We only actually did background checks on anyone applying for management, but during my interviews, I had to ask the applicants if they could pass a background check. As long as they said yes, they were clear. Bad logic, right? So during the season, one of my employees let it slip she wouldn't pass a background check. I wasn't overly worried about it and assumed she just had some drug charges or something. Out of curiosity, I Googled her name that night and learned she had been arrested for prostitution over 10 times in 3 months several years prior. She also had a charge for continuing to prostitute after she found out she had HIV. After this, I got super curious about everyone else and ended up Googling all of them. One of my associates had a charge from several years prior where he and his cousin had broken into an elderly couple's home and kidnapped the gentleman, driving him to an ATM and having him withdraw money for them. Story 8. Throwaway response, kinda on subject. I have a criminal record and have managed to find work over the years, partly because I worked behind bars and I was self-employed for a while. Also partly because I now live permanently in Europe, and they can't get to my criminal history. What's worrying to me is that I've now found a career that I really enjoy over here, working with children. My criminal record didn't show on my now home nation's check. I have not yet had to fill an application form, so haven't lied. I just hope that, as laws become tighter, it doesn't come up, and if it does, they will overlook it. And just to clarify, my conviction was for fraud. I overpaid a lot of money. When I noticed I made the wrong choice and spent it, then tried to cover my tracks when the questions started. It's nothing dodgy, but I don't announce it at parties. Story 9. Kind of the other side of the coin. I live in a very small country in Southeast Asia. My name is common in my home Western country, but stands out as foreign here. When you Google my name in this Asian country, there immediately comes up about 50 references to a jailed pedophile in the country's capital. He's also from my home country and about my same age. It creeps me out to think that my employer, prospective employer, or new friends might make a mistake if they try to check me out on Google. There is one other person on Earth with my name. He's an absolute retard and a true embarrassment. I've had odd questions from family and employers regarding his antics. I even reached out to him once to let him know that he was effing me up. I think he doubled his efforts at effing his life up just to mildly inconvenience me. Story 10. When my mom had her business, she was letting me recruit people because of my, as she calls it, computer skills. So one day, a guy applied and seemed nice at first. The interview went well. He was all suited up and classy. After checking his documents, I did some research on him. Couldn't find anything about that guy before 2013. 2 days later, when we interviewed some more people, we were interrupted by the police asking if they could ask some questions. They showed us a pic of the guy that was applying and asked if we know where he is. So we gave them all the documents he had left for us. Turned out he was searched for red rumming 2 people and identity theft. Well, some days later, I found him and they informed us. We still don't know why he applied for a job at our business, but I don't even want to know why. Story 11. Years ago, I was interviewing someone who listed being a supervisor at Starbucks as part of her resume. Asked her to share a story about tough conflict resolution. She shares that she caught an employee stealing. She said it was tough because she couldn't tell anyone. Why? Because it would get him in trouble. Okay, so how did you deal with it? I tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't stop. So then whenever he was going to steal something, I did it for him so he wouldn't get in trouble. There was no sense of wrongdoing on her part. No guilt. Seemed kind of proud of her answer, perhaps thinking I would be quite impressed with how she handled it. I walked out and had a hard time figuring out if this was one of those fancy interview consultants that higher-ups sent to see how we react, or if she was just nuts. Story 12. We hired a temp who seemed really sketchy. She dressed okay, but smelled like she took a bath in perfume. She had the attention span of a gnat, but I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. She went to lunch, and I found her Facebook, and she looked super strung out in all the pics. She comes back from lunch 2 hours later saying she got lost. She didn't drive. She hung out in the parking lot after work for an hour and a half till our office admin called her a cab. One of the girls finds her on Facebook and says she's friends with a mutual acquaintance who says she's super into hard drugs. She shows up the next day and is sleeping at the desk with the girl training her. She says it's some new meds. I escorted her out the door at that point. Story 13. Interviewed a guy for a night stalking position that required a certain amount of independent work because the night team was a pretty skeleton crew, maybe 3-4 people tops, for a large store all night. The boss was former RCMP and really strict about having people pass background checks, especially for positions where they'd be handling money or spending a lot of time alone. This guy swore up and down that the only thing in his records was a DUI from 15 years previously. He'd changed his life, been to rehab, etc., and it would be fine. Criminal check came back with literally over a dozen convictions, multiple DUIs, breaking and entries, theft, assault, parole violations, failure to appear, you name it. It was a smorgasbord of crap. Called him back to ask what the F, and he said, "Oh, I didn't think any of that would show up." Story 14. So I worked at Rite Aid as a pharmacist, and we were looking for pharmacy tech. Girl comes in with face tattoos and I don't know how many piercings. My dipstick pharmacy manager hires her because at least she has experience. Background check came back okay. She had an attitude and was terrible with customers. A former tech who moved on to work with the town police did his own check on her and found a few assault records and her mugshot. He told us to Google it, and there it was. Dipstick managers still didn't fire her. Took an HR intervention to get her to put on indefinite suspension. 2 months later, she contacted me to ask if I could be a reference for a job in Chicago. I laughed out loud so hard. Implying facial piercings affect one's ability to hand out packets of pills? Story 15. Wasn't in charge of hiring, but I used to run background checks for potential workers and volunteers at an animal shelter. A middle-aged guy wanted to volunteer, and we have to make sure the people don't have any history of animal abuse, among other things. Found a nasty assault and theft charge against him from 10 years prior, and after that it was like the guy completely disappeared off the radar. Had to call and ask him to explain what he did during those years because there might be a mistake. Couldn't get a hold of him. A couple more days pass, and I see his mugshot on the news. He was in prison and had just escaped 2 days prior to wanting to volunteer. He was on the run. Story 16. Was hiring somebody who put a different name on his application than the one in his passport. He was using his passport as proof of eligibility to work in the UK. I asked him about this, and he said he'd changed his name recently, but didn't offer up a reason as to why. He seemed like a lovely guy and was more than qualified for the position, but I decided to Google his original name just to make sure. First few hits were news stories from local papers about him being a notorious football hooligan and having been to prison for glassing a 60-year-old man in a pub. I believe in second chances, but he knowingly lied on his application, which told me that he probably hadn't changed. Story 17. Trucking company a few years back. With a lack of drivers, we were told if he has a pulse, he is 80% in. So we fast-tracked this guy. Monday, 3-day orientation. He is a full 100% driver by Friday. As we are booking him a load, he said next Tuesday he has to be home. Ask him why. Driver: I got a court date. Me: okay, assuming it is a minor thing, can you go back out on Thursday? Driver: I don't know, it depends on the judge. Me: what do you mean? Driver: I'm up for double attempted red rum. Fired before his first trip. Story 18. I'm not the employer, but I remember the whole situation. A new salesman was needed in a small but growing company. The advert went out and they interviewed multiple candidates. One was successful, and he joined. He was ex-RAF and seemed to be a decent being until a fellow staff member decided to Google him and see what comes up. I do this. He had been in prison for frauds, selling false insurance to young drivers. This was serious, as our company dealt with insurance companies and similar clients. He was fired and kicked out on the spot. Story 19. Girl was hired before her background check results came back, as the position desperately needed to be filled. 2 days later, she was let go once it came out that she had been convicted of illegally disposing of a corpse. Her explanation was that someone had overdosed in her/her SO's home, and they didn't want to be charged for that. This is why you fill out all the proper forms before dumping inconvenient corpses at the local playground at 3 a.m. Story 20. I needed to hire a person to do cold calling for me a few years ago. Came across a woman on Indeed.com that I thought was perfect for the job. So I started looking her up online and came across her Facebook page. It was basically covered with nothing but anti-Obama rants and claiming he was the literal Antichrist. And she had links to her YouTube page where she had a video explaining how she had a dream that proves this. Suffice to say, I never contacted her. Story 21. Not in HR, but I sit next to them and often hear amazing tales. Weirdest one I can think of was a guy who on his resume listed a special skill of, I can tell if someone has diarrhea just by their smell, along with an extensive explanation of his ability to diagnose gastrointestinal problems by using his nose. On a resume. Googling his name led in turn to various fetish websites and, well, he was out of the running. Story 22. I'm a healthcare recruiter. A surprising amount of RNs were once prostitutes, at least in Milwaukee. Also, Facebook is where the real dirt comes out. Yeah, it's true employers can't discriminate based on it, but they all do. If you talk about drugs, baby daddy drama, partying, and crap-talking your employers on social media, don't expect your career to go far. I just read it. Makes no sense to me why you'd want anything about your life made public. Story 23. Oh my god, my chance! I ran a background check on a completely respectable woman with a good resume wearing a nice suit. When we got it back, it included prostitution, drug possession, intent to sell, terroristic threats, 3 DUIs, and several indecent exposure charges. I had to call her and tell her it wouldn't work out. She couldn't figure out why, not for the life of her. Story 24. My manager told me a story about an interview he had with a candidate that was perfect. Near the end, they had already decided he was the guy and started talking more casually about what he did in his free time. His response to, "What's your favorite hobby?" was, "Hard drugs and blow." He didn't get the job. I'm sorry, I thought this was America. That guy. Story 25. Was interviewing potential candidates for a driving position. A 60-year-old male comes in, wins me over heart and soul. Just a real dedicated guy. Really professed the love of his family, extremely polite. Background search revealed several drug charges and armed robberies from over 20 years ago. I really wanted to hire him anyway, but that was a huge no-go at my company. Story 26. Sean Eckard, the bodyguard who hired the guy who whacked Nancy Kerrigan in the shins during 1994 U.S. Figure Skating Championships, applied under an assumed name. He's no longer alive, so I don't think this is a rules violation. In a sea of red rummers, pedos, and every imaginable kind of felon and scumbag, this is the one that stands out. Story 27. Many years ago, I made an offer to someone in the healthcare field. His background check was fine, but his state licensure dragged on, so we couldn't let him work until then. License never came through because after we had run the background check, he ended the life of his grandmother, who he lived with, by stabbing her multiple times. Story 28. We were hiring people to be security officers and had one guy that did great on interview and was a shoo-in. When we got the background back, we found out he had just recently gotten out of jail for stealing aeroplanes and currently had a warrant out for his arrest. Job service thought he would be a good fit for security. Story 29. The worst is theft from my employer. I had a guy come in with that, and I sat back and realized I would rather hire a red rummer than this guy. The red rummer's chances of ending the life of a coworker are probably lower, and technically I'm not liable for that if it happens. God forbid, God forbid. But a theft, I'm totally liable. Story 30. I wasn't doing the hiring, but my coworker was. A girl came in and interviewed for my work, and everything went really well, and my coworker was planning on hiring her. A few days later, there's a news article with her face on it. Apparently, she attacked someone with a hammer. We were pretty shaken. Story 31. UK people, anyone know if a background check will show former names or just things associated with it? For example, would it say Mr. Former Name worked for this place this time? Not a big deal. I don't have any kind of criminal record. Just curious. Story 32. One of the first things we do is Google you and check out your Facebook. My favorite profile picture was of this girl's butt. Zoomed in, lacy underwear. Made me laugh. Lock down your Facebook and have a decent profile picture before you turn in your resume. Story 33. I once interviewed a guy for a mental health care position who turned out to be a dedicated and outspoken neo-Nazi. He was really open about it on his Facebook. I found it extremely creepy since I'm Black/Arabic and he was super polite to me. Story 34. Got a resume for a vet tech position from someone with an MD. Well, that just doesn't make sense, so Googled her. Turns out she'd lost her license and spent the last 6 years in prison for dealing prescription drugs. Story 35. Felony conviction and resulting prison time related to the suspicious disappearance of his own son. Ultimately, he was convicted of gross negligence. The DA had tried for red rum. Story 36. Had a guy's background check come up with an explosive charge once. According to him, he had fireworks in the state of California, and they don't really mess around. Story 37. What exactly gets pulled up when they do a background check? Can they see all the companies you used to work for in the past 5 years? Please leave your stories in the comments. I'd love to make a video of them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.